On a January morning in 1801, Jane Austen penned a letter to her sister Cassandra about an upcoming visit to Bath. Reflecting on where in the city they might stay, reflecting on where in the city they might take lodgings, Austen writes, quote, "It would be very pleasant to be near Sydney Gardens. We might go into the labyrinth every day." The labyrinth to which Austen refers was indeed part of Sydney Gardens, a detail of which can be seen here in this print by John Natas. Often referred to as the Vauxhall of the West, these gardens are now, of course, home to the Holbourne Museum, where we have the privilege of presenting our work on the second day of the Georgian Pleasures conference, and I can't resist saying what a pleasure it is to be here in this particular location. I think there could be no better place in Bath to explore our collective theme. I didn't choose that dramatic feature. Laid out in 1792 by Bath architect Thomas Baldwin, finished by Charles Harcourt Masters in 1795, and updated by John Pinch the Younger in the early 1800s, Sydney Gardens is a piece of A-list Georgian heritage. It closed as a paying pleasure destination in 1853 when the Bath Proprietary College became the tenant of the hotel and grounds. But only 2 years later, part of the gardens reopened for musical events and flower fêtes. Eventually, in 1908, the city of Bath bought the gardens, presenting them to its citizens as public space. Essentially, Sydney Gardens have been open to the public in various ways for almost all their 218 years. From the building of the railway to the need to keep up with fashion in pleasure tourism, change came continuously to the gardens throughout their existence. And despite some radical remodification, Sydney Gardens were not destroyed, as we can see. These 4 hectares are thus widely acknowledged to be special survivors of Georgian landscape architecture and garden design. But, as historian Brenda Snadden explains, archival records directly related to the design of Sydney Gardens are in short supply, with the result that the extant landscape, as well as prints, drawings, and descriptions of the time, are precious historical resources. But none of these resources provides a definitive picture of either the garden as a whole or the labyrinth in particular during the period 1795 to 1815, the period that interests me. I'll open my talk then with a question. What was it about these pleasure gardens, and specifically the labyrinth for Austen, that held out such appeal? Austen's comments about Bath are famously few, and her positive reflections on the city rarer still. Her wistful words about Sydney Gardens' labyrinth have thus been quoted many times, but, to my knowledge, without elaboration beyond the fact that Austen liked walking. As an architectural historian interested in gendered spatial experience, my interest is piqued by this rare enthusiasm for an aspect of Bath, especially one that would seem to embody all that Austen disliked about the social whirl and frivolity of this place. I'm also intrigued that the labyrinth in particular was a destination that Austen envisioned with pleasure for herself and her sister, 2 women. Rather than dwell upon Austen as an individual or her tastes, although I will come back to her, in this talk I want to explore Sydney Gardens suggestively, bringing certain theoretical approaches together with a general introduction to the pleasure garden typology and the specifics of these gardens' design and use. My purpose? To gain some ground towards or illuminate a rather more complex question than my first, namely, how did pleasure landscapes of the Georgian period produce gendered subjects? Now, I must say from the outset that I make no pretension to expertise on Sydney Gardens, and am happy for that reason that we've heard some wonderful papers already about pleasure gardens in general and about Sydney Gardens in particular. Yesterday, scholars Steve Poole and Matthew Spring considered the changing fortunes of this landscape in terms of, respectively, its social and musical histories. Likewise, I can't proceed before acknowledging the debt my paper owes to published sources on the Sydney Gardens, including the small selection you see here, as well as to a number of people who have shared knowledge with me in other ways, including Dan Brown of Bath in Time, who provided at least half the images that you'll be seeing in this paper. And I would like to also mention Kirsten Elliott, who had a very enlightening conversation with me yesterday. This is the individual who will be leading the tour of the gardens later this morning. And like some of the winding paths you shall see on that tour, I would like to take a short detour myself to help explain why I chose to focus on Sydney Gardens and how I chose to focus that interest. While this is my first paper about Sydney Gardens, I am not new to Bath, as Bobby mentioned. My 20-year association with Bath has been driven by one goal: to understand the ways that historical women have had an impact on its built environment. To this end, I've done a range of projects, many of which involved public art as well as research, and I won't go into detail, but one example would be my study of the design and daily operations of the Bath Penitentiary and Lock Hospital, which promised refuge and reform to women who wished to leave sex work behind, but which actually often functioned more like a prison. Yet even at the lowest social scale and denied their freedom, inmates produced profit from sewing and laundry, contributed to the institution's annual budget, and thus to changes to the building over time. Without their labor, the building we see today simply would not have happened. More recently, my work on Bath has moved to landscape, specifically a commemorative arboretum built by 60 suffragettes in Edwardian Bath Easton. The only known collectively designed feminist landscape, or suffragettes would in England, was bulldozed in the 1960s to make way for a housing development. My research attempted to recreate, through photographs, interviews, diaries, and mapping, the overall design of this space, and make a public argument for the better commemoration of this history. And just a quick aside here, as Bobby mentioned, we collaborated, the Center for History and Culture at Bath Spa University, and particularly Bobby Anderson and Elaine Chalice, collaborated with myself, Dan Brown, and a few politicians to create a series of commemorative events in coincidence with International Women's Day in March 2011. And one of the outcomes was a planting of a commemorative tree in Royal Victoria Park, which you see here. A number of you will recognize yourselves in this image, and this was definitely the highlight of my career. In all instances, my goal has been to intervene in public memory and make space in the scholarship on Bath's architecture and heritage for women's history. In this, I follow the lead of feminist architectural historians Lynn Walker, Gwendolyn Wright, Anne-Marie Adams, among others, who work with Henri Lefebvre's idea of the production of space over the question of architectural authorship. This perspective allows the consideration and inclusion of women who did not necessarily train as professionals, but who produced space nonetheless, such as the inmates in the penitentiary or the suffragettes in Bath Easton. Jane Rendell's 2002 book, The Pursuit of Pleasure, Gender, Space, and Architecture in Regency London, continues in, but also departs slightly from this vein of scholarship, and it is a major methodological inspiration for my talk today. And now we're halfway around my detour. We're coming around the bend. Rendell opens her argument, with two seemingly disparate texts: French philosopher Luce Rigorai's 1977 essay, Women on the Market, and Georgian journalist Pierce Egan's Real Life in London of 1821. The latter, as we heard about in yesterday's plenary, is an example of the literary genre of the urban ramble, in which men describe their pursuit of the urban sites of leisure and entertainment. Reading these two texts against one another and reflecting on laws affecting women in the Regency period, Rendell underscores how, quote, men move and look, whereas women move or are moved between men as commodities. Also, how men and women are distinguished from one another in relationship to property and space. Men own property, women are property. Men own and occupy spaces, and women are space, end quote. Rather than leave her discussion on this depressing, if historically accurate plateau, Rendell seizes upon its inherent dynamism, pointing to the centrality of space in any discussion of gender and vice versa. How space is gendered thus becomes much richer than the well-trodden binary of public versus private, a distinction Rendell questions. Relatedly, works of architecture cease to be isolated and static objects and reconfigure as part of the vital knit of human subjectivity and the designed environment. To see space as simply the neutral backdrop, or perhaps the passive vessel, for human action misses something crucial, Rendell argues, as can be seen in this etching of Egan's protagonists, Tom and Bob visiting an exhibition, not entirely unlike this one. Design space generates opportunities for and reifies gendered social interaction. An exhibition is a place to look at and, for some, contemplate the purchase of an item that appeals to one's wants and tastes. But this seemingly straightforward purpose is not so straightforward once we look at the politics of looking in this print, which communicate Rendell's point precisely, that gendering occurs in and through space, but differently for different subjects. There's supposed to be a highlight. The woman, front and center, sits low before a man who scrutinizes her as if she were a painting. She is positioned as an object both literally and figuratively through the architecture and design of this space, as well as the artist's composition. Yet in the tension between her observer's gaze and her own, which appears directed to the art, we see how space works differently for every body. Thus, no simple description of a design space can account for its full dimension, nor its affect for different genders. What period artworks depicting the pleasure garden tend to show are either socially approved behaviors or their opposite. So the dancing at the center of this print is in contrast to the little punch-up happening to the left. What these images tend not to show are the subtle ways individuals using space complicate and texture their given roles, collaborating with what geographer Rob Shields calls the affordances of the designed environment. So what I want to underscore then is the idea that design spaces are agents or collaborators in human subject formation, as much as humans in turn are agents in the production and daily reproduction of space. To put this another way, in my past work on Bath, I've been eager to show how women made the city and its landscapes. In my talk today, I'm interested in how landscapes shape subjectivity and provide the occasion or platform for the expression of more than one version of the self. With Rendell's insights in tow, I believe that Bathwick's Vauxhall of the West can contribute to the study of gender in the Georgian era as well as space. The link is the garden. Roy Porter wrote, "Nothing could better epitomize the Georgian love of pleasure than the pleasure garden." As we have heard in several papers already, the 18th century garden resort was a form of entertainment for men and women of, if not all classes, then at least all with a few shillings to spare, in Porter's phrase. You can see in Canaletto's 1751 painting of the London Vauxhall Spring Gardens formal axial layouts, integrated architecture such as the orchestra pavilion to the right, and rows of decorated supper boxes visible just to the left. Men, women, children, and sometimes pets traverse the open spaces, moving in pairs, groups, or solo, stopping at destinations like the blue Turkish dining pavilion in the middle distance. The generous promenades afforded views of one's company, of course, as well as of the purpose-built attractions. But the pleasure gardens also provided access in a rapidly urbanizing age to the increasingly precious commodity, nature. More precisely, pleasure gardens enveloped their paying customers in artful mise-en-scène in which nature was carefully cultivated towards human enjoyment. What pleasure gardens tend to be remembered for, however, is less this integration of organic and conceptual, and more the stunning variety of diversions within. No surprise there, a short list of what one could purchase for the usual 1 shilling entrance fee to Vauxhall, for example, would include fireworks, fountains, live music, alfresco dining, balloon riding, bowling, dancing, berry picking, and illuminations, marvelous structures lit by hundreds of tiny oil lamps. In their more dramatic incarnations, pleasure gardens could include lion tamers, waltzing horses, dramatizations of historic events such as the eruption of Mount Etna, the siege of Valenciennes, or the Battle of Gibraltar. Whether promenading in their best clothes with the backdrop of live nightingale song or watching ordinary people rub shoulders with the quality, patrons of the famous pleasure gardens of the 18th century described these spaces as magical. The brilliancy of the lights at Ranelagh inspired Fanny Burney's Evelina to feel, quote, she was in some enchanted castle, fairy palace, for all looked like magic to me, end quote. But the pleasure garden of the 18th and early 19th centuries was without doubt a space of ambivalence as well as pleasure. Criticizing the garden seems almost to have been a pleasure in itself. Many denounced the ways these secluded, intricately designed retreats thwarted chaperones and encouraged illicit encounters, pickpockets, and the mixing of social classes. As one of the objects of an emerging discourse on taste that sought to sever the fine arts from rank or effeminate pleasure, these gardens relied on their popularity to combat an increasingly hostile view of their supposedly feminine frivolity. The great pleasure gardens of Georgian England, Ranelagh, Cooper's, Holbourne, and Vauxhall, seen here, bore the brunt of the criticism and garnered the bulwark of praise. Peter Borsay observes that these 4 gardens comprise only a fraction of the pleasure gardens that proliferated across England in this period. But to focus on these major gardens, he writes, skewers the picture of the role of the pleasure garden as a leisure type, end quote. The vast majority of what we today call pleasure gardens were in fact mineral water or tea gardens, places that emphasized delightful floral settings rather than blockbuster entertainments. In fact, the only common factor among landscapes designed for public pleasure in the long 18th century is that they were gardens, a fact, Borsay observes, has tended to be neglected. Several historians of pleasure in the 18th century have observed that women outnumbered men in their consumption of pleasure gardens. Pleasure gardens were useful to marriage-minded women and their guardians, and perhaps unintentionally, they provided a well-designed venue for romantic assignations and sex work. I wonder, though, if this aspect of the pleasure garden has been overstated. If we consider the larger cultural and economic dynamic in which middle and upper-class women spurred the production of art, fashion, entertainment, and even the urban realm itself, then the popularity of the pleasure garden for paying women clients comes into a little more focus. Sydney Gardens fall somewhere between the major pleasure gardens of London and smaller tea gardens throughout the country in terms of design, scale, ambition, and audience. Leaning on and drawing visitors from Bath's reputation as a spa town, Sydney Gardens also participated in and benefited financially from the entwining of pleasure and wellness tourism in this city. Drawing from Peter Borsay, J.G. Barker Benfield writes, quote, "The connection between refined pleasure and women's susceptibility to nervous disorders played a fundamental part in the renaissance of spa towns during the 18th century. The builders of spa towns' social infrastructure and of the urban renaissance as a whole wished for, indeed assumed, the presence of women in redesigned public environments," end quote. In Georgian Bath, the commercial impetus of health and healing, as well as the social and material economy of the marriage market, intensified the relationship between women and the developing urban realm. Barker Benfield contends, at spas, women's wishes and women's complaints were the purpose, end quote. It's not hard to discern how the wishes and complaints of affluent women helped to shape the built environment of towns like Bath, which responded to an influx of female clientele through the creation of women-friendly bathing establishments, hotels, shops, theater and assembly spaces, lending libraries, and of course, pleasure gardens. And here are some fashion advertisements that suggest or attest. in their own way, to the importance of outdoor space for the discovery, coveting, and display of new garments. Bath had many tailors, milliners, places to buy ribbon, gloves, textiles, and so forth, such as number 5 Henrietta Street, which advertised undergarments for the ladies in the late 1790s. The ad's copy remarks on the shop's proximity to Sydney Gardens as an additional feature. Some garden designs explicitly called to women, such as Liverpool's Ladies' Walk, whose seaside situation and ambulatory purpose prompt Peter Borsay to suggest that beyond the display of new dresses and coats, such walks involved an active engagement with nature. Pleasure gardens were, like promenades, squares, crescents, and circuses, the glue that fused the changing shape of the 18th century city with what Borsay calls the public heterosociality of the joint pursuit of pleasure. Compared to other 18th century towns, Bath was big, but compared to London's population of about 1 million in 1800, still small. So Bath's population was closer to 35,000 on that date. I've found references to 6 pleasure, tea, and mineral water gardens in the Bath area, which I've mapped in this slide using contemporary topographical and street mapping for reference. The presence of so many working pleasure gardens suggests that these were, typologically, a local hit, even if Sydney Gardens would soon shut its nearest neighbors down. You can generally see that Bath's pleasure gardens were situated along the course of the Avon River, but not exclusively. Also, the eastern side of the city appears to have been favored, likely in response to the early urbanization in that elbow of land west of the river, and also the early industrialization of the riverside south of the growing city. By the mid-1700s, that area was already strongly associated with dirt, smell, the poor, and crime. On the east side of the river, marshy Bathwick developed somewhat later in the Georgian period, and the balance that many pleasure gardens attempted to strike between urban pleasure and rural setting was to be found here. So just to quickly review, and I don't have precise operational dates for all these facilities, there was Villa Fields, which is meant to be highlighted and yet is not, but it's the second mark pointer down from the top. One of its entry tokens is on view at the left, and this was built on the fields surrounding the now demolished Bathwick Villa, somewhere near today's Boatman Riverside Restaurant. Talk about historical continuity. And then to the south, the very south of this image, the marker indicates King James Spa, also sometimes referred to as King James Palace Gardens in Lincoln Vale, which was built up near Lynn Brook. And you'll note the entry price of 6pence, which was quite a bit cheaper than some of the prices that we've heard about in the last day. Yesterday, Dr. Spring explored the musical offerings of Harrison's Walks and Assembly, located in St. James Gardens, later the Institution Gardens, and you can see an image of these in this 1855 watercolor by Henry Venn. So there's a clustering of gardens in the middle of this map. Harrison's Walk is the one below, at the lower point of that clustering. And this view of 1740 by Thomas Grigg looks back across the river from the vantage point of Spring Gardens, which Dr. Spring also discussed. And this is today the site of Bath's recreation ground, and rather ironically for me anyway, a small maze built in 1984 as part of the Bath International Music Festival. Grosvenor Vauxhall Gardens open to the east of the city, so that's the point to the very top and just to the right. In 1792, this garden would become the Ring Garden post-war housing development in time. And last, Sydney Vauxhall Gardens, which we've already heard about, opening in 1795, which hopefully you can see, but is third down from the top. Okay, good, it works. One more map, since we're looking at them. It underscores the one possible reason why Harrison's Walks and Spring Gardens both closed a few years after Sydney Gardens opened. Advertisements of the era show, particularly in the case of Spring Gardens, that these destinations tended to offer the same type of amenity or attraction in terms of food, music, and entertainment. But the scale of the garden, and thus the diversity of Sydney Gardens' offerings, was undoubtedly different. In this detail of Harcourt Master's plan of 1808, drawing heavily from Thomas Baldwin's original plan, we can see a fair bit of detail about the layout of the gardens, and I'm really hoping my highlighting has worked. These gardens were planted in 1792 to give growing time in advance of the opening date. The overall plan, as you can see, is lozenge-shaped and bisected by the Avon and Kennet Canal. And I'm showing an image of the gardens before the intervention of the railway, just so that you can get a sense of what, in Jane Austen's time, the program would have been like. And as was mentioned yesterday, the canal was a value-added feature of the gardens, boasting 2 Chinese bridges that allowed picturesque views over the riverboats and adjacent footpath. Yes. To the left of the property is what would become Sydney Hotel, today's Holbourne Museum, which had a gated drive and, thanks to Great Pulteney Street's wide boulevard, a distinguished arrival. Immediately behind or east of the hotel was an open area flanked by refreshment or supper boxes. We heard a bit about this yesterday. These were a sort of marriage between picnic tables and row housing that permitted one to dine out of doors without fear of being drenched in a sudden shower. We may wish that those were still in place later when we go on our walk. The curving form of the supper boxes also gave excellent views onto the graveled circular walk, where ladies and gentlemen might sup or stroll to music of the movable orchestra that was also situated here. The long walk linked one end of Sydney Gardens axially with the other and was the only such path. At the eastern termination, a loggia was situated, providing visual continuity with Harcourt Master's neoclassical hotel to the west. A perimeter ride encircled the site, which would eventually be chopped up to provide space for some of the villas and gardens that are now ranged on the edges of this site, and we'll see those later. But in the period that interests me, the ride was very well used by women on mounts and provided an additional field of separation between the more intricately designed garden interior and the exterior walls, which helped maintain the illusion of being in another world. Central to this illusion were the serpentine pathways and varied plantings, which, as Stephanie Points observes, would have provided screening for clients or privacy while also contributing to an exaggerated sense of the site's size. Moving inside again, the two bowling greens could be found on either side of the long walk, adjoined by pathways to other attractions. And I won't go into details about these, but in early days, the attractions included the faux ruin of a castle, I've just highlighted the location, complete with moat, and a hermit's hut tucked against the inner southern boundary. But as you can see from its relative size on this plan, the star attraction of the Sydney Gardens was the labyrinth. Twice the size of the maze at Hampton Court and built a century prior, the labyrinth at Sydney Gardens was a special draw for visitors. Stephanie Point's report on the history and evolution of Sydney Gardens explains that the labyrinth was one of the original features created shortly after the opening in 1795. At half a mile long, the maze could take up to 6 hours to traverse. The plan of the labyrinth, this plan, is possibly also the plan one could purchase at the entrance. They had to provide them because people got so lost, but you could only buy one with an additional 3 pence on top of your entry fee. This image shows several At bottom left, I want to point out the entrance to the grotto, which is actually the exit from the labyrinth once visitors had made their way to the center. And although they are difficult to discern in this image, the reward or discovery at the center of the maze were one or several Merlin's swings. I doubt you can read the text, but that is what is indicated in this highlight. Inventor John Joseph Merlin, who apparently liked to dress up as Cupid in pleasure gardens and shoot darts at women, named the swings after himself, something he seems not to have done for his other inventions, which included roller skates, wheelchairs, and the automata of a swan. It's not completely clear what the Merlin swings looked like, as historic accounts are inconsistent. I suspect its design modified over time. What is certain is that the Sydney Gardens had various types of swings in several locations, but the center of the labyrinth was reserved for the Merlin swing alone. Baroness Frances Bunsen, an artist who paid a childhood visit to Sydney Gardens shortly after their opening, recalled, quote, "A Merlin swing in which the swingers sat 2 by 2 opposite, those at the corners pulling ropes alternately by which the swing was set in motion. And once in motion, I saw one gentleman become paler and paler, till he almost fainted and had to be helped out of the swing by a gardener." In this gently satirical image by John Nixon, the apparatus is somewhere between a traditional seated swing and a swing boat designed for 2 people to ride together. So between the description that I just read in this image, this is one of several examples of how it's unclear what the Merlin swing really was. Nonetheless, this is obviously an image of the swings at Sydney Gardens, so I'll work with it. This benign scene, like Bunsen's account, appears to support Julie Wakefield's assertion that the Merlin swing was not some Fragonard-inspired decorative swing for lovers, but rather a form of exercise machine, and perhaps, if Bunsen's description is anything to go by, a rather vigorous one at that. Nixon's couples hardly strike the viewer as amorous lovers playing games of seduction in the relative seclusion of a thickly wooded enclosure, as in Honoré Fragonard's famous painting, The Swing, to which Wakefield alludes. And certainly advertisements from the era, such as this one, from the garden's first summer, definitely state that the swing was most conducive to health. So that was the spin. Yet there is another layer of significance to the labyrinth, the swing, and its pleasures. First, towards the end of the 18th century, the word labyrinth itself had become associated with the losing of one's moral way, and with the quest for and risks found in women's sexual organs in particular. This association likely had something to do with the increasingly labyrinthine spatial character of Georgian pleasure gardens, whose dark walks, secret arbors, and lovers' groves had become explicitly aligned with the possibility of sex and the abandonment of morality. So that's the labyrinth. What about the swing? Well, we can't forget that the swing was at the center of the labyrinth. Fortunately, Pierce Egan, who we've already heard something about, did not forget this either. His Walks Through Bath of 1819 provide an instructive reading of the struggle to reach the swing. He writes, "It might puzzle any cunning person if left to himself and without a clue for 6 hours to acquire the much wished-for spot. And it is rather a difficult task when the explorer of the labyrinth has the direction pointed out to him from a man stationed in the swing. The ins and outs necessary to be made, it is said, measure 1/2 a mile. When the swing is made and the secret unraveled, the guardian of this sort of fair Rosamond's bower conveys the visitor once more into the public walks." Egan, of course, here is referencing the fiction that Rosamond Clifford, one of the lovers of Henry II, lived in a hunting lodge that he had built for her, surrounded by a dense labyrinth, presumably to keep her in and other men and his jealous wife out. I don't think I read too much into Egan's description if I suggest that failing to reach the much wished-for spot, especially under the watchful eye of the guardian, already in the swing, seems akin to sexual insecurity, possession, and reward. Now, it's entirely possible that Egan was simply living up to his biographer's assertion that he was always prepared to embellish the truth in the interests of entertainment. But this description, like Egan's other writing, seems to assume a male heterosexual readership who will relate to the connotations of the mysterious, elusive labyrinth, likewise the hope of supplanting the guardian in the swing at the center. But surely this is not what drew Austen and her sister to consider going to the labyrinth every day. A wide variety of Georgian publications were dedicated to the cultivation and layout of gardens, addressed to men and to women, such as The Beauties of Flora Displayed, or Gentleman and Lady's Pocket Companion to the Flower and Kitchen Garden. This slim volume included advice, interestingly, on the most desirable situation for a pleasure garden for domestic use. A number of plates represent spiral plantations in different formations, such as you see here. And with these, the author's strongest recommendation is to place the plantation so as to give onto a view. Gendered and spatial politics of looking come immediately into play. When assuming a male reader, Swindon asserts that these plantations, if well designed, can afford an agreeable retreat. But, he specifies, should a lady grace this garden, she may, by spectators from distant hills, be taken for goddess Flora in all her charms. Thus, while in a garden of their planting men may find retreat, a lady finds herself on display, and not even as herself. One can begin to imagine how a labyrinth, with its resistance to and confounding of the gaze, might be a welcome reprieve. But what of actual women gardeners? Long entwined histories of women's cultivation of plant life in gardens and art precede both the labyrinth at Bath and Egan's sexualized description of its merits. Avid gardener, lay scientist, and Duchess Mary of Beaufort collaborated with a botanical illustrator in the late 17th century to produce a remarkably detailed set of prints for her enormous collection of over 1,500 specimens. Gardener-turned-artist Mary Delaney produced 1,700 intricate flower paintings in the last 2 decades of her life, each work assembled from hand-colored tissue and based on a real specimen, which Delaney had dissected before beginning her creation. For these women, making, looking at, and occupying space in gardens exceeded the limited role of object to be seen, of ornament. Their work speaks to the deep pleasure of acquiring knowledge, responding to beauty, being inspired by, moved to act by the world around them. These beautiful pieces compel me to think about how a garden or cultivated landscape acted upon each of these 18th century artists, prompting their collaboration in the creation of something new. In other popular publications of the era, such as the Lady's Diary or Women's Almanac, readers had the opportunity to test their intellectual and deductive powers through lengthy series of brain teasers, which I think would put today's puzzle page to shame. Readers, which certainly included men as well as women, were given complex spatial challenges to work out. Interestingly, the authors of the problems often used a garden as an anchor for the problem. This brain teaser from 1755 reads, "Within a rectangular garden containing just an acre of ground, I have a circular fountain whose circumference is 28, 40, 52, and 60 yards distant from the 4 angles of the garden. From these dimensions, determine the length and breadth of the garden and likewise the diameter of the fountain." In this case, and you can see the response, a male reader or reader with a male pseudonym responded with a detailed diagram to prove their answer. In this example from 1788, one Mr. Alex Rowe submits a problem revolving around a piece of land which a lady would like to divide in such a way as to yield the most profit possible. The answer by Gemini, probably a woman, demonstrates a powerful grasp of geometry and economics, certainly beyond my capacities. Another problem asks readers to divine the geometry of a fish pond at the center of an imaginary garden. You get the idea. What these and many other examples of this type suggest to me is that as a print culture dedicated to women's pleasure, the Lady's Diary and other periodicals also help to build women's competencies and capacities in terms of being able to determine the spatial characteristics, dimensions, and relative scales of gardens and plots of land they had never seen. And I can't help but wonder if the skills attained, even for a few, would have aided in the problem of the labyrinth, whose organization was invisible from the outside. To return briefly to Jane Austen, it's clear that she read popular print sources directed to women of her era. The one example being The Conclusion of Emma, her 1815 novel, is a rebuttal to an account in the November 1802 Ladies' Magazine of one Mr. Knightley, who marries a deserted orphan. Those of you who are familiar with Austen's fiction will know that this is the reverse of what actually happens in her book, in which the fictional Mr. Knightley famously marries the intelligent, discerning, if single-minded, Emma, while the orphan, Harriet, marries a farmer closer to her class position and, it seems in Austen's view, her capacities. So Austen was likely familiar with the brain teasers and logistical spatial puzzles of 18th century women's press. But perhaps the greatest indication that Austen may have been drawn to the spatial and deductive pleasures of the labyrinth at Sydney Gardens is the emphasis that experts have placed on these aspects of her work. In the 1950s, Vladimir Nabokov painstakingly mapped the spatial arrangements of her novels, from character arrangements within specific rooms to the relative distances between real and imaginary places. Literary historian Janine Barkas uses maps to understand the factual and historical aspects of Austen's work in her 2012 book, while Michael Suk-Young Che's 2013 publication with Princeton, Jane Austen, Game Theorist, goes even further. Suk-Young Choi argues, quote, "This beloved writer theorized choice and preferences, prized strategic thinking, believed that jointly strategizing with a partner is the surest foundation for intimacy, and analyzed why superiors are often strategically clueless about inferiors." And this point about being clueless, while it may feel anachronistic, does in fact take us back directly to the most detailed surviving description of Sydney Gardens' labyrinth from the Georgian era, Egan's Walks Through Bath, in which a man, socially, economically, and legally any woman's superior, goes hunting in the labyrinth for Rosamund without a clue. The gendered aspects of Austen's preference for the labyrinth begin to surface. For clueless male visitors to the labyrinth in Sydney Gardens, the pleasures of finding the center and Cupid's invention had to do, discursively at least, with the spatialization of the mechanics of sexual desire, chase, and conquest. Egan could not be more direct. The inducement to enter this fair Rosamund's bower is Merlin's swing. The pleasures of swinging, no matter how healthful, were clearly also libidinous, but this is not the end of the story of swinging in the Georgian era, as it were. While the sexual pleasures of the labyrinth for women were surely also present, and who is to say they were exclusively heteronormative, there also seems to have been the rather different pleasure of having a clue. The pleasure of solving spatial problems in real space, in effect of experiencing spatial mastery, cannot be underestimated in an age when women regularly developed their intellectual capacities in precisely this way, and were, furthermore, finding opportunities to share in the fullness of public space, namely the garden. I'm now in my conclusion. Fast forward 200 years. Stuart Harding and David Lambert's Parks and Gardens of Somerset and Ruth Gilding's historic public parks in Bath were my excellent introduction to the integral role that urban landscape played in the formation and evolution of this city. They were, however, books born of desperation, as parks and gardens throughout Somerset were being swallowed up by development or destroyed through underfunding and neglect. Just as the first volume was being prepared, however, the Heritage Lottery Fund formally launched the Urban Parks program. Like a miracle, Lambert writes, grant aid was now on offer. For so long, the poor relations of heritage architecture, urban parks were now the subject of by far the biggest program of grant aid for parks and gardens the UK has ever seen, end quote. The shift in fortunes of the poor relation of urban parks and gardens in 1990s England was a decisive victory in the larger battle to stem the steady march of landscape destruction worldwide. In a place where heritage is so closely aligned with stone and mortar, the effort to save, understand, and foster landscape special heritage is all the more impressive. The hope today is to restore some aspects of Sydney Gardens' past identity as a pleasure landscape and to gain Heritage Lottery funding for the process. To this end, some amazing projects have taken place, such as the beautiful extension by Eric Parry, which frames and really draws attention now to the gardens. But I'm also thinking of the annual light installations, the Colorscape project, and Bruce Munro's beautiful and thoughtful Field of Light. Equally important, I think, is the Holbourne's embrace of the mandate as received by the HLF to develop deeper understanding of the park's current use and users. For me, a remarkable project is Ghosts in the Gardens, a collaboration this year between Dr. Steve Poole at the University of Western England and the Holbourne. Using a Georgian listening device, which Dr. Poole has kindly brought in for you to look at here, a gorgeous object, visitors traversed the gardens according to what they had once been and who was once here. Dr. Poole found evidence of various users of all classes, male and female, who then became the basis for the ghosts, who talked visitors through the pleasure garden from different perspectives. In my view, this is an ideal model of the scholarly, interactive, and community-oriented placemaking that is possible between institutions, academics, and the public. Its success is, in my view, a clear indication that people want to know about the histories of the past, the histories of the places they live in and care about. With women still slightly in the majority of the population of this city, I think there is also good reason to hope that the garden's gendered past will also strike a powerful chord. The Historic and Local New Bath Guide of 1812 was happy to report that the goddess of pleasure has selected this city as the place of her principal residence. Clearly that goddess smiled upon women because, as the guide continues, the Sydney Gardens were sure to entertain the ladies. I hope my talk today has suggested some ways in which that entertainment went beyond passive consumption towards active engagement with the spatial and material specificities of the pleasure garden, a space incorporating cultivated plant life, art, and design. As public places where women with some means could exercise preference, knowledge, skill, pleasure gardens can be understood to have afforded new opportunities within class and gender constraints. They thus belong to the growing range of spaces that feminist historians such as Hannah Barker and Elaine Chalice have identified as important to 18th century women's individual and collective identification. The fact that women who could afford to do so kept coming back suggests that the appeal of the commercial pleasure garden at the turn of the 19th century was multiple, as was the experience it sought to supply. And in repeatedly choosing that manifold experience, women seem to have chosen, with pleasure, the exercise of their individual capacities in the company of women. Thank you.